All right, well, it is 12:02, and I'll go ahead and get us started. My name is Dave Feldman. I'm the Director of Water UCI, and it's my privilege to be the MC for today's event, which is a Water UCI colloquium entitled Trading Water in California, Past, Present, and Future. We're delighted to have Andrew Ayres, who's a research fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. Just a couple of announcements before we begin. We have another colloquium coming up next week entitled Remediation, Regulation, and Reform. What we're doing about the issue of PFAS that has been in the news recently. It'll be on March 3rd in the afternoon. It will be a panel discussion. We sent an email blast out today. You should be receiving that, and you're able to begin registering for that immediately. We look forward to that. A little logistical announcements before we begin. We're going to start by a little biographical information about Dr. Ayres. And after his remarks, which will be about 30 minutes or so, we're going to open it up to a Q&A. On the link today, you will see a Q&A icon. You should use that Q&A icon if you have questions that you would like to pose to Andrew Ayres. Not the chat function, please, but the Q&A. Time permitting, we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Andrew Ayres, who is a research fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. His main areas of interest and research include environmental and natural resource economics, environmental and institutional economics, applied economics, and water economics and policy. He's going to provide an overview of water markets in theory and in practice with special application to California, which has a number of water markets ongoing, and he's going to discuss those. I should mention that his most recent work, while focusing on California's Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA, he's also worked previously in Germany and in the US on projects to inform policymaking related to climate change, energy, river restoration, and water pricing. His PhD is from a joint program between the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management, as well as the Department of Economics at our sibling institution, UC Santa Barbara. Andrew, welcome. It's a delight to have you with us.
All right, thank you, David, for the great introduction. I'm excited to be here and to get started talking about trading water in California. So there you go. For today's talk, we have a brief outline here. I'll start by giving a little bit of a foundation for why we might want to have a market for water and what good it can do. And then I'll move through sort of the three chronological phases that were promised in the title. The past, in which I'll cover sort of recent activity and trends in California's water market and put it in context with the rest of the West. The present, which we'll talk about markets in the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, implementation of which is sort of just ramping up right now. And futures, in which I'll talk about sort of new financial products that have come around and recently been released that will help people understand water markets and hedge their risk in them. So first of all, why have a water market? So I've listed sort of three reasons here. The first of which is that markets will help water users manage scarcity and, in a way, reduce the costs of misallocation. This is sort of the standard efficiency argument that you'll see in most basic economics textbooks. And in many ways, it derives from the fact that in a market, people with lower value uses of water now face an incentive to reallocate that water to others with higher value uses. Another reason is that more broadly, markets help resolve competing demands on the resource. So as conditions change over time, either new demands emerge, Supplies may change, for example, with climate change, or new technologies might come about that change water use and its efficiency. Markets are going to be providing a low cost opportunity to resolve competing demands and reallocate the resource. And finally, markets can help ease the provision of public goods. And so there are a variety of public goods that depend on water, one of which might be, might come to mind as in-stream flow. In many cases, the ability to transact in a market to acquire water and dedicate it to in-stream flows will really ease the provision of that public good, not only because it makes it easier to get water in the river, but also because with a strong property rights system, it makes it easier to protect that water once it's already in the river. So water is not always scarce, but where it is, markets often arise. And sort of the three places globally that people often look to identify and learn about markets are the Western US, Australia, and Chile. But all three of those examples demonstrate that there are certain enabling conditions that you need in order to have a market. So the first is well-defined property rights to water, or at least allocations of who gets how much water when. This always starts with an accounting system that defines the asset that is going to be traded in the market and defines it in such a way that everybody has a common understanding of what that asset is. The second thing you'll need are buyers and sellers, or in other words, some parties must value the resource or its application differently from one another. If all the users of water are doing the same thing with it and they all have the same amount of water, there will be not a lot of scope for reallocation through the market. Third, you need to have pretty good information, not only about sort of basic market fundamentals like who has an asset to trade, what price might they be willing to trade it at, and especially in the case of water, what are the resource conditions that might dictate whether water is actually available for sale at a particular time and place. But you'll also need information about impacts on third parties. So this is a complicating factor in markets for water, where moving water around can oftentimes have impacts on other water users within the same river basin or groundwater basin. So having good information about what those impacts look like is imperative. And finally, markets operate on trust. And so in this case, I mean not only trust between counterparties to a transaction, a buyer and a seller, but very importantly, trust in sort of the overarching governance system that's going to regulate what happens in transactions. For example, in the case that a counterparty cannot make good on their side of the deal, there needs to be a robust governance system to address that, which will induce trust in market transactions. So with that all set up as a foundation, we'll dive in a little bit on California's water market and its past trends now. But first, we'll look west-wide. And what you see in the image here is a map of the West with market activity over the past few decades represented by a sort of heat map where the lighter colors demonstrate more transaction activity. And so trading is not new to the West. It was going on throughout the 1900s, but it's really picked up since the 1990s. This map and the density of trading shown within it sort of hints at some important factors in supply and demand. So in the Southwest, where things are very hot, there's a lot of trading going on because supply is variable, but elsewhere in the West, where there are large demand centers, whether it's for growing urban areas or even large agricultural production areas like the Yakima Basin in Washington, there's quite a bit of trading as well. These markets vary in their spatial extent and in the type of participants. But one thing to take away from this is that California is a major center of water trading in the West. Now, before talking too much more about water markets, it's important to understand what is the asset that people are trading. So I'll give a little bit of an abbreviated introduction to California's surface water rights. It's easy to find tomes that have been written about the design of the water rights system and questions related to it, but today we'll do the one slide version. So California's water rights system for surface water is a bit of a hybrid system in that there are riparian water rights, which means that people who own land that abuts a water course, for example, a river, have a claim to divert water off of that river, and prior appropriation water rights, which are established through diversion of water off of a water course and its use on lands that don't abut that same water course. Now, riparian rights generally cannot be traded in the way that we think about a water market because they're pertinent to that parcel of land, but prior appropriation rights can. Originally, these were motivated in large part by early mining demands during the sort of settlement of California in the mid to late 1800s, but those claims are still around today. All of these claims are subject to reasonable and beneficial use requirements, meaning that the water must be used, it cannot be stored or speculated upon. But these reasonable and beneficial use requirements often enable sort of low value uses like growing alfalfa in the desert. In addition to these private surface water rights, many users also hold contract entitlements with major state and federal water projects within the state, namely the State Water Project managed by the California Department of Water Resources and the Central Valley Project administered by the US Bureau of Reclamation. Entitlements to water deliveries under these projects can also be traded with some limitations, but they make up a large proportion of traded water in California. So here we'll see a time series of water market activity in California based on data that we've collected in the Water Policy Center at PPIC. And these bars of various colors show both sort of short-term leases of water and permanent sales over the past few decades. And a few things to point out are that, you know, the California water market, at least in terms of trades that can be tracked through official sources, has grown pretty significantly since the mid to late 80s. And it tends to see upticks during periods of drought. But one other interesting trend here is that the proportion of long-term leases or sort of multi-year deals has increased recently. There are several drivers for this, and one of which is to sort of economize on the administrative approval process for trades. So, you know, parties might be more interested these days in getting the pre-approvals done for a transaction for many years in advance, but maybe only transacting in some subset of those years. And that leads me to some of the challenges that exist in California's water market and are ongoing. So the first is conveyance capacity. You know, when we're trading surface water, it's necessarily the case that as a seller, I must have a way to somehow get that water to the buyer. And when we're pretty far apart, that requires conveyance through canals or aqueducts or some other sort of conveyance infrastructure. In some cases, trades that otherwise would be beneficial can't occur because there's no way to get the water between the parties. As I mentioned just a moment ago, administrative barriers can also be cumbersome. This administrative review is important to assess what third-party impacts might be occurring from a transaction. But in many cases, this review can take not even just weeks, but also months, which really constrains the ability for people to move water flexibly. Finally, local economic implications of transfer sometimes hold up deals in that local governments, irrigation districts, or community groups will oppose water transfers knowing that moving water out of their community might have adverse impacts on employment prospects. And finally, uncertain title to water, so uncertainty in the property rights to the asset, can also act as a disincentive to trade when people don't have faith that the asset being transacted will actually bear water in the future. But despite these challenges that are signs of increasing complexity and formalization, in part in response to those challenges, so in addition to sort of the expansion of multi-year agreements in the past few decade and a half, 2 decades perhaps, additionally, people have been looking to more complicated deals that involve drought year options. So especially in cases where supplemental water is only needed during drought, A water district might contract with individual farmers or a different district in order to prearrange a price that would be paid during drought in order to sort of secure those supplies for when they're needed. This can really help address local concerns about economic impacts because the water won't leave the source region for sort of in perpetuity, but only under certain circumstances. In addition, there are ongoing efforts to better understand the existing claims to water. So many claims were established decades, if not over a century ago, but even during the most recent drought, state regulators realized that they had difficulty unraveling exactly what those claims were and who had legitimate claim to water during a drought while others did not. As an example, sort of water rights on the Fresno River, which is a major tributary to California's San Joaquin Valley, are currently sort of set to be clarified further through an adjudication process with the State Water Resources Control Board. So that covers a bit of the past and the lead up to today. One of the things that's really sort of salient with water markets right now is their importance in the implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. So SGMA, as it's known, was adopted in 2014 by the legislature. And in broad terms, it applies to groundwater users in critically overdrafted, high and medium priority basins throughout the state. Those are seen in red for critically overdrafted and sort of yellowish for other SGMA compliant basins in the map on the left. What SGMA means by the letter of the law is that users in these basins have to avoid undesirable results when those results are significant and unreasonable. So that would include chronic lowering of groundwater tables, depletion of streams through overpumping of groundwater, and other similar undesirable results. In practice, what this really means is that they're going to have to balance the inflows and the outflows from their groundwater basins. So they'll have to balance the recharge into the groundwater as well as the amount of extraction through mainly pumping. When is this happening? So the formation of public agencies that are tasked with implementing this has already started. Initial plans for the critically overdrafted basins have been submitted, and more are on the way for the not critically overdrafted basins. But the implementation time horizon doesn't finish until 2040. So we're very much still in a ramping up phase in terms of understanding what's going to happen with SGMA. And in particular, you saw that most of those critically overdrafted basins are in California's San Joaquin Valley, in the southern half of the Central Valley. And the SJV really faces a SGMA challenge. So historically, the price of groundwater in this area has been approximately zero beyond the costs of actually bringing the groundwater to the surface. And this has led to a high reliance on groundwater as a drought buffer for both agriculture and to some extent urban users as well. What you see in the image on the right in panel A is the amount of overdraft that groundwater users identified in their plans that were submitted last year. And in panel B is our recalculation of that overdraft based on a common set of years. So the big takeaway here is that the plans acknowledge overdraft. In our recalculation, it's a little bit higher than what was reported, but 1.7 million acre feet on average per year represents about 11% of net water use within the valley. So that's a very significant amount of reduction that will need to happen. But many of these plans sort of foresee recharge-based solutions. In other words, increasing supply to the groundwater rather than cutting back on pumping. Our calculations suggest that those initial plans are a little bit unrealistic and more demand management will be necessary than what's planned right now, which brings us back to the question of why have a market? And one of the reasons we identified is that by directing water use towards the highest value uses, trading in this case, or at least in part, surface water can help reduce the costs of reaching groundwater sustainability. So the figures on the right-hand side of this slide represent sort of the results of some analysis that was done by colleagues of mine at PPIC, showing that compared to a very inflexible sort of proportional ramp down of pumping for all users, allowing local water trading can really reduce losses in crop revenue as well as farm-related GDP within the valley quite substantially. In short, allowing people to trade surface water would help maximize the returns to the resource use and reduce the costs of reaching groundwater sustainability in the San Joaquin. But it's not just trading surface water that's going to be important for SGMA implementation. Groundwater banking and trading will gain importance as well. So groundwater banking refers to the practice of taking surface water and purposefully putting it into a groundwater basin in order for extraction later on. And this has been happening in the San Joaquin since the mid-1990s, but its importance will grow in the future. And in addition to that, groundwater markets are likely to emerge, and some have started already within the San Joaquin Valley. So examples are sort of popping up in Kern County and Madera County. And these are just like trading surface water mentioned a moment ago, really being developed with the eye towards reducing the costs of sort of taking a diet on groundwater in the future. So what I'd like to do now is sort of pivot and talk about what we can learn from examples of existing groundwater markets in California, which are few, but they're not non-existent. And one example is from the Mojave Desert. So the map on the right shows the Mojave River and the associated nearby groundwater basin and its location in California, just north of the Los Angeles basin. Now, the Mojave Desert is the driest in North America. It receives very little recharge, and that combined with pumping for both urban uses and agriculture resulted in persistent overdraft from about the 1940s onwards. Stakeholders in the area decided to adopt a property rights-based system to delineate who had the right to pump how much water when in the 90s. And sort of key components of this system were that people were grandfathered in at their initial level of pumping in the 90s, and then there was an annual ramp down in the amount that they were able to pump. And the idea was that this ramp down would eventually lead to sustainability. The basin was also sort of delineated into here 5 different sub areas, and these sub areas you can't trade between them, so they're going to have their own supply and demand characteristics by sub area. Trading here involves agricultural users, urban users like Victorville and Barstow, here denoted on the map, and also the environment. So right here, you'll see a time series of spot market trading. So in other words, just annual leases of pumping rights in the Mojave Basin across all of its sub areas, beginning in the water year of 94-95, which is when the trading opened in these sub areas. So trading was sort of rare in the first year or two, but it quickly accelerated to over 20,000 acre feet in 1996, and it's been over 20,000 acre feet ever since then, every year. Now, for perspective, today about 100 to 120,000 acre feet are pumped annually out of the Mojave Basin. So this is a pretty substantial of water being transacted in any given year. And you'll see that most of that is happening in the Alto sub-basin, which is where Victorville is located. And now what I'll tell is sort of a story in 3 parts about what the impact has been in terms of the basin and the local economy. So the first thing to note is that this new system really helped to halt overdraft. This is an image from a recent paper of mine with some co-authors at UC Santa Barbara. And it shows sort of the depth to groundwater over time in the Mojave Basin based on sort of local recorder wells. And you'll see that in the 1990s, when the adjudication came into effect, the new property rights system came into effect, the water table really stabilized. Now, the early 1990s also saw imported water come into the basin. So it's important to note that part of the initial adjustment is because more water was coming in, but over time, that ramp down really played an important role as well. So across the sub areas within the Mojave, the total ramp down from the initial pumping allocations lies between 20% and 50% today. So they've taken a big haircut in terms of groundwater pumping. Now, through the late 90s and 2000s, these restrictions that have been progressively cutting into people's pumping allocations caused prices to increase. So what you'll see here is a time series of prices for permanent sales. So no longer annual leases, but people are transacting here the right to pump water in perpetuity. And you'll see, late 90s and early 2000s is when these prices really start to take off, especially in the Alto subbasin, where there's been quite a bit of ramp down and there's a bit of demand from growing urban areas like Victorville. Now, all of this has had the sort of end result that in order to stabilize this groundwater table for the long term, this trading has resulted in agricultural decline in terms of revenues, which you can see in the panel on the right here. At the same time that water table started stabilizing due to the increased ramp down, the amount of revenue from agricultural production has declined precipitously. So from about $50 to $60 million per year prior to the adjudication to maybe half that, or approximately half that thereafter. Now, in this paper, we've actually estimated that sort of the overall benefits of defining these property rights and bringing the basin into balance are somewhere on the order of $400 to $500 million. And in large part, these have gone to farmers. So what all of that is to say that, the property rights-based system that enabled a market here has helped to address long-term overdraft in the basin in a way that has sort of shared those benefits broadly, in that those who have been undertaking the cutbacks to really make that happen have also been compensated for it. The story here for the San Joaquin Valley is that similar systems can likely lead to similar successes there, although the story will be a little bit different, because in the Mojave, people were growing primarily alfalfa, very low value crops, and the crops in the San Joaquin Valley are quite a bit different, a lot of tree crops with much higher yields. So with that, that talking about SGMA and groundwater markets is a little bit of a punt to the future as well, because that implementation is ongoing. But I was asked to talk about future directions for water markets, and in particular talk about new financial products that are enabling futures trading. So first step here is, what is a futures contract? So a futures contract is a contract between two parties that enables them to trade a commodity in the future at a specified price, okay? So in this case, two parties would be contracting to trade water maybe a month or 2 months or 3 months out at a prearranged price. Now, hearkening back to our discussion of enabling conditions, in order to have this market, you have to have good information about water prices. But water market prices can be really hard to know, even in California. Markets tend to be quite local. Most people would not like to report what prices they're trading water at. And even if trading is going on, oftentimes it's thin. So if you were to observe some transactions, it might be hard to know what that would mean for your proposed transaction in terms of price. So something that's been developed recently is the NASDAQ Veles California Water Index. This is a financial indexing product for water prices, and the ticker is right there, NQH20. You can go look it up right now. What this is, it's been developed by Westwater Research, which is a water market analytics firm. And it's a volume-weighted average of California water prices as observed in markets throughout the state. A new value of this index is posted every week in dollars per acre foot, which is a standard sort of pricing metric for water all over the West. And what this index is going to do is it enables a derivative product, which is the water futures. So essentially, two parties can contract to buy or sell water at a future date on the basis of this index price. But it's important to note that these futures contracts are all going to be cash settled. No futures are going to result in a physical delivery of water in the future. And I'll kind of describe in more detail in a few minutes what exactly this means, but these are not transactions that are planned for the physical water market. These are purely financial contracts that are basically bets on the future value of the water price index. These contracts are going to be settled once per month, and the first trade's actually already started. The first trades in futures started in December of 2020. So first, let's talk a little bit more about the index upon which the futures market is based. And note that sort of the components to this index are both statewide in some ways and local in other ways. So the index is, as I mentioned, the volume-weighted average of prices from both the surface water market and several groundwater markets that Westwater has identified. So the groundwater basins include the Chino Basin, the main San Gabriel, the Mojave, only the Alto sub-area that we were just talking about a few minutes ago, and the Central Basin, all of which are located in Southern California, where groundwater basins with defined property rights are relatively common. In addition, the surface water component of the index is based on trades from all over the state. This includes sort of the prior appropriation private water rights that were discussed in the beginning of this talk, as well as the State Water Project and Central Valley Project entitlements. A few things to note are that in order for it to be included in the index, all the trades must be completed. So there's no, this isn't about quotes for prices or anything. These are completed trades that have already happened. The index excludes multi-year deals if there's no repricing in the interim. And the index includes both sort of the lease price for that specific time, or if permanent sales happen and are observed, then Westwater sort of capitalizes that permanent sales price back to a sort of an instantaneous value for the water. And that's all wrapped into this index. And so what we can see in this plot is, you know, what that index looks like over time. That's the blue line here. And this is juxtaposed here in this plot with some measures of sort of drought conditions in California. So one thing to take away is that the index does appear to respond to drought conditions. So you'll see during the sort of intermittent irrigation seasons over these years that more area in drought in California and exceptional drought leads to higher price spikes. So we're looking at swings from maybe around $200 to $300 per acre foot up to over $600, $700, maybe $800. And the fact of the matter is that this index kind of attenuates price swings to some extent. Price swings in individual markets can be a bit larger than that. And this leads to the, you know, sort of realization that this kind of volatility is a key concern for producers, mainly agricultural producers who are dependent on water to grow their crops and keep their trees alive where they've got trees in the ground. So why would someone bother betting in the futures market? Because essentially the futures contract is a bet between two participants about the price of that index at some point in the future. They're basically, in a simple way of thinking about it, two types of parties who are going to be able to benefit from this. The first are hedgers. Those are people who are exposed to year-to-year volatility in water pricing, so agricultural producers for the most part. They're exposed to the variation in these supply conditions, and they're really interested in offsetting the variance in the price of water from year to year. In other words, they're interested in locking in a price for one of their key inputs, water. So they're going to be taking what are called long positions in the futures market, basically contracting to buy water at a specified price at a point in the future. As a simple example, what, you know, we can consider, what if I wanted to buy a futures contract for June of this year? According to the quotes on the CME trading, futures trading website last night, I could probably do that for about $588 per acre foot, meaning that I could engage in a contract with someone to quote unquote buy water from them for $588 in the third week of June, or the third Wednesday of June, I should say. What that means, if I were to engage in that contract, is that when the third Wednesday of June comes around, I would reap the benefit or the loss of the relative difference between $588 and wherever the index is. How would this be beneficial to me? So if if I use water as an input and the index is above $588, I would get paid out from my counterparty the difference between the index value and 588. So let's say it's $688 per acre foot. That means I would get $100 per acre foot through this contract. Now, that's a good thing for me because if the index is doing its job, the price of water is really higher and hopefully around $688. So that $100 that's accrued to me offsets that difference and really in practice locks in that price of $588. On the flip side, if the index value is lower than 588, I have to pay in to the futures contract to make my counterparty whole. Now, that costs me money and represents a loss, but in some sense, it's offset by the fact that water is less expensive than I thought it was going to be. So my input costs are lower. Now, for this tool to really be valuable for hedgers, they need to understand how movements in the index relate to movements in the actual price of water in the markets that they're transacting in. And this is an open question, and I'll discuss that a little bit on the next slide. But before that, let's talk about these counterparties. Now, these are speculators or market makers who typically represent sort of managed money from hedge funds, pension funds, other sorts of investment vehicles. They're often thinking about this asset in relation to others in their portfolio. So they're really interested in sort of the covariance between how does the price of water move, how does the price of this index move, and how does the price of the other assets that I'm holding move. So a good example of how this could be beneficial for them is just comparing oil versus water as commodities with futures contracts at the beginning of the pandemic. So at the beginning of the pandemic, oil actually traded at negative prices because people holding futures could not find a place to actually deliver the oil that they had to deliver, and they couldn't find a counterparty who was willing to take on that responsibility. So that represented potentially a very large loss for some of those parties who are holding oil, but the water futures market was basically unaffected by the pandemic because water demand and agricultural production have kind of continued unapace to some degree. So that kind of demonstrates how, in this case, a market maker or a speculator could reduce risk in their portfolio by holding both assets, excuse me. So in other futures markets, there are futures markets for more than just oil and water, for many agricultural crops. There have been concerns in the past that speculators might be driving certain price fluctuations or volatility, but some recent research by Ray Fish and Aaron Smith at UC Davis has kind of analyzed 21 major commodity futures markets over about a decade or so, and kind of found that speculators trade in line with price fundamentals, and this hasn't really sort of borne out as an issue in those other markets in the past. This doesn't mean that speculators haven't sometimes lost their shirt in these markets. So one sort of high profile example of this is the California Public Employees Retirement System, which was heavily invested in sort of other derivatives related to future markets through the late 90s and the early 2000s and suffered sort of very large losses. All this is to say it's a hard market to make money in from a speculating perspective, but there is a hope that it can provide a real hedging opportunity for producers who are exposed to water price risk. But this futures market is really nascent, and there are a few outstanding questions. These are just two of many. The first is, will parties, in this case, I'm talking about hedgers, really be able to trace the index movements to movements in their local water market, in the prices they see in their local water market? This is a key aspect for the hedging utility of the tool, because if they can't understand how the index relates to the local water market price directly, it's going to be hard for them to use it to hedge risk. And in fact, it could be preferable for some of them to bet on the weather. And I mean that literally, because there are futures markets that would allow agricultural producers to just bet on basically whether it rains or not and get paid out according to that eventuality as opposed to the value of the index. So that's still a key outstanding question. And another outstanding question is, can the futures market deliver new useful information? So the underlying idea here is that those who know better how the index moves, or think they know better how the index moves, can profit from that. So they have an incentive to develop new predictive tools that will give us more information about water supply conditions and ultimately the market conditions. This better understanding can also have sort of spillover effects that can improve other water management decisions. That might include decisions about investing in long-term physical infrastructure, either to store water or to convey it to other markets. It might also factor into sort of more short-term or medium-term decisions about interannual storage. So how much water do I leave in a reservoir? How much water do I leave in a groundwater bank? But the ability of the futures to deliver this information will ultimately depend on how liquid the markets are and how many participants find it useful. So with that, I'll sort of wrap up just by saying that markets have come a long way if you take a long view. The early clarification of surface water rights system through the late 1800s and early 1900s sort of placed the foundation for the markets we see today, although there is still ongoing clarification of what these surface water rights systems are. We've seen increased formalization and trading over the past few decades, including multi-year deals and the advent of new options type contracts. Groundwater sustainability, a hot topic today and an important part of water management in many areas throughout the state, is going to see increased emphasis on groundwater banking and groundwater markets. And finally, sort of the new trends and sophistication via sort of the development of price indices and futures trading are sort of the newest developments here. So with that, I'll sort of stop and say thank you, and we can take some questions.
Excellent, Andrew, thank you very much. I want to go immediately to our Q&A. Our first question is as follows. Environmental justice advocates tend to be wary of market solutions to climate and resource problems. What would you say to an environmental justice group who worries that the use of markets won't take into account the needs of disadvantaged populations?
That's a great question. I think sort of one of the first things to touch on there is that disadvantaged communities, especially in California Central Valley, but in principle elsewhere in the state as well, really don't stand to benefit from sort of continued open access and overdraft in these in their groundwater resources. So I'm thinking about the case of the development of new markets for groundwater right now. And as evidenced from other cases of groundwater marketing in California, these markets can play a really important role in the first place of bringing parties on board to a management solution that ultimately stabilizes the resource and sort of encourages sustainability. And in doing so, that's going to have benefits for disadvantaged communities through their increased ability to sort of access the resource over the long term. I think it's important to emphasize that sort of reaching agreement on these new institutions to manage the resource can be quite difficult. And to the extent that markets provide sort of an incentive for cooperative behavior in this sense, they can be incredibly valuable. And not only that, adopting the market framework with in the case of groundwater with the overall cap and the subsequent trading it's going to reduce pumping for most, if not all, users relative to the continued open access. And to that extent, other third-party impacts of trading, third-party impacts of pumping are likely to be attenuated as a result. Now, all of that is to say that trading can still result in third-party impacts insofar as pumping effort might be transferred from one user to another, but markets would need to come along with sort of associated mechanisms to assess what those impacts are and to sort of come up with rules to understand how they might best be addressed.
All right, well, thank you for that. We have another question regarding appropriation versus riparian rights, and I'll simply read it. What percentage of water rights are riparian compared to prior appropriation, and does it differ a lot by region?
That is a great question that I can't answer with figures right at the moment, but just my general sense is that in terms of the total number of claims, there are a lot of prior appropriation claims. And in fact, there are more prior appropriation claims on paper than in many cases there's actually water to satisfy. And that includes not just private sort of private prior appropriation surface water rights, but also the water that is distributed through the State Water Project and Central Valley Project systems. You know, those are dependent on ultimately sort of water rights that either the state or the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation hold, and then the individual users have contract entitlements, and those make up a large proportion as well.
Okay, thank you for that. We have another question specific to the Mojave River Basin. Have Mojave River Basin water markets affected the Mojave River ecosystem? And if so, how? Should environmental services and the integrity of the natural environment be a precondition for developing water markets, lest the environment lose out because environmental services and values are often undervalued or not valued at all?
So I will start, I think, by saying that the adoption of the sort of property rights and market-based system in the Mojave, just like I was speaking about a moment ago with regard to disadvantaged communities, ultimately will benefit the river because relative to continued overdraft, you know, water tables will be higher and the ability of the river to actually flow will be supported. In addition to that, part of the Mojave groundwater adjudication involved applying a very small pumping fee for water users within that area that goes into a biological resources trust fund. This fee is arguably trivial in the context of water use within the basin. I mean, it's on the order of maybe $1 per acre foot. It has increased a little bit over time, but these funds are being used to provide environmental benefits within the Mojave River Basin. So that involves sort of on the ground work to clear out some water thirsty invasive plant species that have affected flows in the river, as well as to acquire and retire pumping rights that existed nearby river flow areas, and you know, pumping can have that sort of can have an effect on stream flow by depleting the local groundwater table. Those funds have been used for that as well. And so really, ultimately, the protection of those environmental values is going to come down to what people are willing to pay for them. And they've developed a system there in the Mojave where there is some funding to provide those benefits. And I should also mention that California Department of Fish and Wildlife has also been involved in some transactions for pumping rights within the basin in order to both stabilize environmental conditions for the river, as well as use those pumping rights to irrigate habitat that they've put that they're maintaining. So getting back to sort of why do we want to have a market? The first slide of the presentation. Those are examples of ways in which having a market can enable or at least facilitate the provision of some of those public goods.
Excellent, thank you. Before we go on to the next question, I just want to make a couple of brief announcements. This entire talk is being recorded and will be on our YouTube page, just for your reference. And while we're scheduled to go to 1, we actually can go to 1:15. And that's a great thing because in addition to being a very provocative talk, we have some wonderful questions. We want to try to get to as many of them as we can. I want to turn to this question, Andrew. This is from one of our audience participants. We are concerned in Northern California that all of this will lead to our rivers and drinking water suffering. How do paper water rights or surface water rights beyond what exists impact trading, as more water rights exist than water? Also, is surface water being used as a commodity to replace or recharge groundwater? How do tribal water rights fit in, since they are not quantified?
Okay, there's a lot going on right there. So I guess when it comes to water supplies in Northern California is the wetter part of the state, and Southern California is the drier. To the extent that there's an interest in reallocating that water, you know, I mean, that's been going on for some time through, provision, the operations of both the State Water Project and the Central Valley Project. A key consideration in sort of the expansion of water transfers out of the north and towards the center or the southern parts of the state is moving that water, the conveyance question that I raised early on in the talk, and in particular with moving water from north of the Delta to south of the Delta, that there's a big question mark there, and how much water will be available for, how much capacity will there be to move water through the Delta in the future due to various limitations associated with both sort of physical infrastructure as well as regulatory requirements to protect Delta ecosystems. So that question is a little bit sort of like bigger than what I was intending to talk about today. But I would say that, to the extent that there's increasing demand from the south due to SGMA and the sort of groundwater haircuts that come along with SGMA, there will be more interest in reallocating water from the north. But really a key linchpin in there is the Delta conveyance question. Now, the other two sort of questions I identified in there were replacing groundwater. So, as I mentioned, especially in the San Joaquin, a big part of the strategy there, as evidenced in the first groundwater sustainability plans, has been to recharge those groundwater basins more in order to have to avoid cutting back on groundwater pumping. That'll mean taking surface water, either surface water entitlements that are currently being used elsewhere, or there's interest in sort of diverting high flood flows that previously haven't been captured by anyone in the winter and recharging them into groundwater during the winter when supply is high and demand is low. There's been interest in all of that, and the role that markets can play, as I see it, is not only providing an opportunity for people to move that surface water around if, say one entity is using it and another sees more value in storing it in groundwater, but also the development of accounting systems within these groundwater basins that can undergird a groundwater market is going to further incentivize that recharge. Because in that case, when there's a groundwater market, it's not just the case that I can take those surface water flows and recharge them and sort of provide benefits for the basin more broadly. It's also that I could recharge that water, receive a credit for it under the accounting system, and then later have the option of either pumping it for my own use or trading it to somebody else within the basin. And in that case, one, there would be an incentive to recharge the water and distribute it to others, but also it gets around a lot of conveyance problems, or it can, assuming that you understand your groundwater basin well enough. It gets around a lot of conveyance problems associated with moving that same water along the surface. And the last part of the question was tribal water rights. Really great question. Tribes are involved. Without getting into too much detail, tribes are involved in serious questions around some groundwater adjudications within the state where tribes own overlying land, and the question of how sort of historical groundwater rights have been allocated to them will be either acknowledged or not within those groundwater adjudications are still sort of looming. I will say that there's an increasing interest on the part of not just tribes, but also other water users in better defining tribal water rights throughout the West, because unless those rights are well defined, there can be no negotiations, or at least negotiations will be more difficult when it comes to potentially reallocating some of that water towards other uses. And so, you see this in increasing interest along the Colorado River to get some tribal claims volumetrically defined so that negotiations can start up around transactions that would benefit both other water users and those tribal communities in terms of monetizing their water rights through either, spot leases or long-term transactions that can bring in revenues to support those communities.
Okay, well, thank you. A very complex topic and very broad and fulsome answer. Thank you for that, Andrew. Another question relates to the different purposes of water marketing. Part of the beginning of your talk focused on how water monetization can improve the sustainability of water management. And then later you explicitly focused on the betting on water prices. What is the benefit of future markets like this for water managers and policymakers outside of hypothetically predicting water management needs based on this betting index?
Okay. I'll try to respond to my interpretation of the question. So the benefits of having a futures market, top line benefit as I see it is allowing water users to hedge their risk. Again, these are not contracts that are going to result in a physical transfer of water. They're purely a financial tool for water users who are exposed to risk in the future, meaning that water price could be really high and I'd like to avoid it if I can. Having the ability to sort of lock in prices for that water asset in the future. Now, this can provide big benefits. If it's the case that there's a lot of volatility in the water price, in the real traded price of water, and I have, let's say, almonds in the ground that those trees are going to take well over a decade to mature and start producing nuts that then are my sort of payoff for planting them. And if I don't know what the water price is going to be, it's hard for me to make a decision about how many trees do I plant and how do I manage them? How do I manage that decision? And so, the water futures trading can allow me to have a better expectation that I'll be able to lock in certain prices. Let's say instead of a drought rolls around and I'm on the hook for paying $1,000 or $1,100 maybe per acre foot in order to irrigate those trees and keep them alive through the drought, I can use the futures index to hopefully get a lower price, more in the let's just say $600, $700, $800 range, which is still in the range where the value of that water is justifying itself in terms of keeping the trees alive in the long term. So, that's one of the major benefits that I could see the water futures market delivering, again, subject to the caveats of we don't know, it's still early days. We don't know how many people are going to actually perceive that benefit to be, perceive the water futures trading tool as the best way for them to hedge their risk is really sort of the underlying question here. I think, as I understood the question, I think that's one of the main benefits I see here. There are also spillover benefits I was alluding to if people invest in tools to create new information about water supply conditions, new analytic and predictive tools to understand water supply conditions and the impact of those conditions on the market. That could, inform reservoir or groundwater banking operations, right? If the water futures price for 4 quarters out says that water is going to be worth a lot, then I might think about maybe extracting less from my groundwater banking account this year in order to, again, hedge my risk against the future prospect of very high prices.
Thank you, Andrew. We have another question from the audience, a similar set of issues. How can policymakers determine how far out their decisions ripple into the future? And how much due diligence is appropriate to find out how far-reaching the effects may be as related to water marketing? What should the time horizon on the period of due diligence be?
Okay, so I think this question is getting at the issue of administrative review in water marketing, and so that's a great question. There's PBIC has done some work, and we have a new sort of upcoming publication on water markets and SGMA that touches on some of these questions around administrative review and how to streamline that process. I don't know if there's an obvious answer as to, you know, what's the right time scale to consider impacts. But, you know, I think let's take an example to the extent that a policymaker, whether, you know, in the case of a groundwater market, right? Like to the extent that a policymaker, this would really in practice probably be a groundwater sustainability agency board or some other administrative you know, agent at the local level, is determining whether groundwater trades should move forward. At the very least, when they're evaluating potential third-party impacts, they should consider the full amount of time based on their knowledge of the basin that it would take for that amount of sustained pumping to sort of realize its full impact on other nearby users. So, you know, it might not be the case that if I transfer 1,000 acre-feet of pumping rights from myself to someone else, that in the first year they start pumping that, we'll see all the impacts. It might take several years for the full impacts to materialize. And it's difficult, you know, it's difficult to know those things in advance. There's a lot of work is going in right now to better understand those groundwater basins and sort of the hydrogeological conditions that exist under the ground, so that we can make informed decisions about that. And you know, I think I'll stop there in terms of giving that example. But you know, at the very least, they should attempt to understand you know, the full impact of that new pumping regime. I think a good example of this is you know, one of the new emerging groundwater markets that's sort of resulted from SGMA is in Rosedale Rio Bravo Water Storage District in Kern County. They've put together an accounting platform. They have sort of a marketing system set up, ready to go. And as part of that, they've developed a sort of a groundwater trading modeling tool that will allow them to model, right, under the assumptions of what they know about the basin, to model what the impacts of particular transfers could be, and if they're severe enough, whether that sort of necessitates some sort of conversation about, hey, this trade is going to impact a third party, either, you know, in an extreme case, we might not allow it, or maybe we'll open up a conversation about negotiation amongst those parties. Anyways, so that's one example of sort of how that's being done in new groundwater markets.
Very good, thank you. We have a couple of more questions, and then I think we are getting very close to the end. I don't know if you're familiar with the Cadiz project in the Mojave Desert, but we have a question. Would you care to comment on the proposed Cadiz project?
So what I will say is that the Cadiz project, just for background, I guess for others, is this is a proposal to sort of extract groundwater from the Fenner Basin out in the eastern Mojave and basically bring it to other demand centers. So conveyance is involved in this, and that's a key component of it. The idea is that, you know, you would be able to only draw out, or at least predominantly draw out, groundwater that is otherwise an outflow from the basin. So in this case, as my understanding puts it, this is water that would otherwise evaporate from the surface regardless. And so in this sense, we can maintain sustainability of that groundwater basin and still provide new water resources to other major demand centers. I understand that all of those scientific conditions around the proposed Cadiz project are very much controversial, and I'm not going to weigh in on that at this time.
Okay, fair enough. Andrew, in reference to the fact that you have had a good deal of international experience, I want to turn to one of our very last questions. What do you think of the water market in Australia for the Murray-Darling River Basin? Is it a good example? What can we learn from Australia's experience with water markets?
This is a very big question. I think first and foremost, I'll say I am not as much an expert on the Australian market as I am with what's going on in Western US. But I do think that the Australian case is a good example of movement towards greater formalization of water rights. So they set up a system whereby sort of relatively sophisticated and well sort of well quantified rights for water use within the Murray-Darling were defined. These have been the basis of a market that has produced real economic value in terms of allowing water users to move water from low to high value uses. There's been several good studies published about this, both from academic researchers and from government agencies. It is suffering from certain shortfalls as it pertains to its ability to deliver on environmental benefits that were sort of envisioned as a key component of the transition to this new system. That's in my readings, that's a double-edged sword. There have been failures on that point, and there have also been successes in that the market has allowed the government in Australia, the regional governments, to really acquire water for environmental purposes at much lower cost than might come through other mechanisms like investments in irrigation efficiency. But all that is to say, I think there's a bit to learn, and I wouldn't come down to saying it's a good or a bad example, but it is certainly an example of increased formalization that I think is delivering value, and can be improved, of course, but is doing its job to some extent.
Great. And I'm going to make this our last question in the interest of time, and so we can wrap up. Technologies. How do technologies like cloud seeding or desalination or even other technologies play into water marketing?
Great question. So I guess the first one that would, that I'll mention is the use of satellite-derived information to understand water use. So again, the example I mentioned just a few minutes ago, Rosedale Rio Bravo, that entire accounting platform is based on satellite-based measurements of evapotranspiration on agricultural fields. And so that's a technology that was not available to us as a sort of a pillar in the definition of rights or allocations to water in the past. And so, I think, again, even with that technology, it's early days to a certain extent in understanding how well that will really function, and in particular, how well that will be accepted by stakeholders in other contexts. But it is being used there, and to the extent of what role does it play? It plays a foundational role, because you can't have a water market without a common understanding of what the asset is that's being traded. I don't know so much about cloud seeding, but I will comment that when it comes to desalination, desalination, generally speaking, is an expensive source of water. And so when I think about that in response, in the context of water marketing, I don't think it's going to be the case that people are typically going to be, building desal plants and then selling that water to anybody. It's usually going to be your last marginal supply. It's pretty expensive to both build and bring online. But to the extent that we can break down some of the barriers to water trading in California and give coastal communities the opportunity to really transact and negotiate for mutual benefit with other water rights holders that maybe is difficult today because there isn't conveyance, or because administrative review during a drought is too difficult, or what have you. To the extent that we can break down some of those barriers and facilitate more mutually beneficial exchange that way, it might even reduce the need for expensive desalination if people are able to meet their needs more cost effectively through the market.
Very good. Since we're on the subject of technologies, let me see if I can't squeeze this very last one in. How might water markets incentivize distributive water and closed loop solutions to water problems?
I mean, I think that my initial reaction is they would incentivize it in much the same way that they incentivize the reallocation of water from low value uses like alfalfa to high value uses like almonds or something like that, in that, people who view the opportunity to use that technology and essentially conserve their water and recycle it or put it to some other use, won't need to go on the market and acquire additional supplies. That's true of, that's sort of primarily true of individuals and firms who are sort of directly involved in sort of wholesale or sort of large scale water transfers. To the extent that signal will trickle down or filter down or be passed on to like individual homeowners or those who building owners in urban areas or something like that. There are a lot of other questions surrounding that I'm not going to get into right now about how water rates are defined and to what extent they really reflect scarcity. But
well, this has been an outstanding presentation and perhaps one of the most provocative in terms of questions that it has prompted. And Andrew, I just want to thank you very much for your presentation, and we'll have to find a way to get you back to talk about some of your work for PPIC and elsewhere.
okay.
I want to just remind the remaining participants, Shannon has posted in the chat the fact that the webinar is being recorded. It will be available on our YouTube page beginning tomorrow. And please do RSVP for our next event, Remediation, Regulation, and Reform, what we're doing about PFAS in our water. That will be March 3rd, next week, from 3 to 4 p.m. Very exciting panel discussion. Again, thank all of you. Andrew, thank you so much. And I want to thank Shannon, Associate Director of Water UCI, for all of her work in planning this event. Han Parker, Doug Colby, and others in the School of Social Ecology for all of their assistance in making this event happen. So have a great rest of the week, everyone, and take care.